Hi everyone, and thank you for joining. The color in Romanian for today is verde. 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 Well done guys, you just said green. Oh, today's case is just mind-boggling. It really is, and also I find it quite fascinating at the same time. But before we get started with today's video, I just want to give you my usual disclaimer. Everything that I give you in the video is already found in the public domain. All the information is in the public domain. I put together the information, I compile into a video, and I bring this information to you, as well as my own views and opinions about the case. Also, this video is for educational purposes only, and I don't mean any disrespect to anyone I talk about in today's video. Thank you so much. And just a trigger warning, this video will include descriptions of women being strangled and raped. So if this is something that you don't want to watch, then I will see you in the next video. As for everyone else, thank you for staying with me, and let's get into it. You see the man, you'd forget his face in an instant. He doesn't really seem memorable. Just a driver passing through towns, a customer sipping on a beer, a man stuffing his face in the burger on his plate, a guy looking for pleasures on a well-known strip. Samuel Little would terrorize the US between the 1970s to 2005 and would end up confessing to 93 murders. He got caught by chance in 2014 after 44 years of killing sprees. Now, no one can forget Samuel Little, or Samuel Mcdowell, nicknamed the Choke and Stroke Killer. The FBI confirmed him to be the most prolific serial killer in US history. So let's just start at the beginning. Samuel Little was born on June 7, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, then a small town of 871 residents, about 45 minutes away from Macon. He was born to a mother he claimed was a prostitute. Samuel's mother, Bessie Mae Little, was a teenage sex worker who lived with her grandmother the year that Samuel was born. The census from that year said that Bessie Mae worked as a maid, listing her as living at her grandmother's house on Macon Street. His father was 19-year-old Paul McDowell, who also lived in Reynolds, near the railroad depot. At birth, Samuel's last name was also McDowell. According to various reports, Bessie Mae gave birth to Samuel in prison. Samuel would say about his mother that she was a lady of the night. Throughout his life, Samuel would use the name Samuel McDowell. Samuel later told journalist Gillian Lauren from New York Magazine in an exclusive interview that his mom abandoned him on the side of the road when he was a baby. Samuel's paternal grandparents moved to Northeast Ohio to a house a few blocks away from the U.S. Steel Mill in Lorain. Samuel soon moved in with them, taking their last name as his own. His paternal grandparents ended up raising him in Lorain, Ohio. By middle school, he got in trouble for stealing and was sent to a reformatory school for teenage boys when he was 13 years old in 1954, called Boys Industrial School, outside Columbus, Ohio. His booking card listed him under the name of his grandparents, McDowell, and said that he was there for stealing. His IQ was listed as 96. His mother was listed on the booking card as whereabouts unknown. Samuel claimed that he was sent to this school as punishment for stealing a bicycle. The boys at Lancaster spent half their days in school and the other half doing manual labor. They lived in cottages which were overseen by older boys and segregated by race. Samuel was assigned to farm duty where troublemakers were often sent. The farm crew raised animals such as chickens and cows and vegetables including carrots, cabbages and lima beans. Boys could also take part in the drill team and Golden Gloves boxing. Students aimed to have the fewest disciplinary reports since that could lead to early release. After his 1.5 year stay there, by the time he was released to his grandparents in September 1955, Samuel racked up 47 reports. Most of the other boys there only had 1 or 2 reports. He later attended Hawthorne Junior High School, where he had problems with discipline and achievement. Throughout his youth, Samuel had several more run-ins with the law, including a 1956 arrest for burglary in Omaha, Nebraska, where he served time at a youth authority. In 1957, prison records in Columbus showed that he broke into a Denley's dry cleaners in Lorain and was sent to the Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield. He was paroled from Mansfield after a few years, but then sent back in October 1961 for breaking into an abandoned furniture warehouse in Elyria. He received a 3-year sentence, which would be his longest prison stretch until he was finally captured in 2012. Later, Samuel said he learned to box during his teens at Mansfield using his then 5'11" 155-pound body to assault other inmates. He was paroled from Mansfield again in December 1964. In a grainy photo taken on the day of his release, he was a gangly 24-year-old. He had grown up in prison. The reformatory in Mansfield was closed by court order in 1990 due to overcrowding and inhumane conditions. The prison is best known as the filming location for The Shawshank Redemption. Having spent most of his teenage years and young adulthood incarcerated, Samuel was paroled from Mansfield in December 1964 at the age of 24 years old. But he was arrested again 2 years later in 1966 for assault and battery after attacking a woman in Cleveland. Around this time, he got married in Lorain, but his marriage didn't last. On his booking paperwork, he listed another woman as his wife. He listed her later too after an arrest for stealing several designer jeans from a Higsby's at Midway Mall in Elyria. The paperwork said that they were married in Lorain in 1965 and then separated. By the late 1960s, Samuel had left Cleveland for Florida. His mother, at this point, resurfaced. Bessie Mae Smith was listed on Samuel's Mansfield paperwork at a Miami area address. It was in Miami in the early morning hours of New Year's Day, 1971, that Samuel Little committed his first confirmed murder. It was there that he picked up Mary Brosley at a local bar on New Year's Eve, 1970. In the early hours of 1971, they drove to a deserted stretch of road near the Florida Everglades, where he committed his first murder, strangling Mary and burying her in a shallow grave. Samuel returned to Cleveland a few months after murdering Mary. On May 28th, he was arrested for the early morning robbery of a Clark gas station in Westlake. While in prison, in September, he was charged with sodomy and aggravated assault. By December, the robbery case made plain dealer headlines when the state's key witness, Samuel Little's girlfriend Lucy Madero, who was present at the robbery, was forgotten by police, the courts, and prosecutors. He was literally forgotten. They left her in the county's jail off Payne Avenue for almost 6 months without cause. The jail was so run down that inmates could talk through holes in the walls and ceilings. As Samuel told the story later, Lucy told the cellmate named Aurelia Jean Dorsey that she intended to testify against Samuel. Before the trial, Aurelia met Samuel and warned him about Lucy, and she was right, because Lucy Madero testified against Samuel when the case came to trial in March 1972. But with the tip-off from Aurelia, Samuel was prepared. Aurelia even testified on his behalf. Records show that the jury found him not guilty. According to Samuel, Aurelia Dorsey was no beauty and she was 30 years his senior, but her act of loyalty persuaded him to take up with her. She taught Samuel how to fence stolen goods, a skill that subsidized their life of wandering. She was his traveling companion, shoplifting expert, and surrogate mother. Samuel's grandmother, Fannie Mae McDowell, died in 1972, followed by his mother, Bessie May, in 1973. Aurelia Dorsey remained Samuel's old lady until she died of a brain hemorrhage in Los Angeles in 1988. They moved around the Midwest and South throughout the 70s, and the two supporting themselves by stealing and, doing some other odd jobs. While he was arrested for an array of petty crimes, he spent very little time in jail. In the years between 1957 and 1975, Samuel Little was arrested 26 times in 11 states, a number which only climbed over time. He managed to avoid charges, both petty and felonious, in his travels, including shoplifting, rape, assault, kidnapping, and murder. As they crossed from state to state, Samuel Little and Aurelia Dorsey settled into a routine. Night after night in a seedy motel or cheap apartment somewhere, wherever, Samuel Little put Aurelia Dorsey to bed. After she went to bed, he went out into the dark where he would hunt for his victims. Even though he confessed to multiple murders across both regions during this period, most of his victims' identities remain unknown, according to the FBI. Over the following 3 years, Samuel said that he committed multiple murders in Miami, including a transgender woman named Marianne. He also claimed he killed a woman in Prince George County, Maryland in 1972, which has been matched to a pre-existing Jane Doe case. In September 1976, he was arrested after kidnapping and raping a woman outside St. Louis, Missouri. The victim said Samuel choked and beat her before raping her in his car. He was convicted of assault with intent to ravish, rape, and sentenced to 3 months in county jail. Samuel Little went on to check out the Gulf Coast, claiming victims along the way. He viciously assaulted 2 SEX workers in Pascagoula, Mississippi, but both managed to survive the attacks and testify against him decades later. In Pascagoula, he was also arrested for shoplifting, and he was later charged with the murder of Melinda Rose Lapre, who was last seen getting into a car with a man identified by witnesses as Samuel Little. A grand jury, however, declined to indict him. He was then extradited to face charges for the rape and murder of Patricia Ann Mount in Gainesville, Florida. He had been seen leaving a bar with Patricia, whose bruised, naked body was later found in a field. He was acquitted on all charges. Samuel's murder trial had very little effect on his thirst for violence. He told investigators he went on to kill up to 10 women in the South and Midwest, and some of these have been linked to existing cold cases, such as the murders of Mary Jo Python and Francis Campbell. By late 1984, he had landed in Southern California, where he was arrested for assaulting 2 women in San Diego. He was tried for attempted murder and pleaded guilty to assault and forced imprisonment and served 2.5 years in prison. Following his conviction, Samuel had to submit a DNA sample, which was entered into a national database maintained by the FBI. After his release from prison in 1987, he relocated to Los Angeles. Then, suffering from a surge in homicides due to the crack epidemic and gang violence, the city became a hunting ground for a series of serial killers who preyed on women in high crime areas. Samuel Little confessed to numerous murders in LA throughout the following decade. He continued traveling across the Southwest and up to Ohio, killing as he went. He claimed that his final victim was a woman he strangled in Tupelo, Mississippi. Investigators suspect that his victim was Nancy C. Stevens, whose body was found on the side of the road in August 2005. 2 years later, Samuel was back in LA where he was arrested for possession of cocaine. He pleaded guilty and was ordered to attend a court-ordered drug rehabilitation program. He never showed up, and then a bench warrant was issued for his arrest. Samuel Little was not linked to the serial murders until 2012. That's when Los Angeles Police Department detectives discovered that genetic information gathered from 2 unsolved homicides, the 1989 murders of Audrey Nelson and Guadalupe Apodaca. These were a match to Samuel's DNA. By tracking his social security payments, detectives located him at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. The U.S. Marshals Fugitive Task Force took the 72-year-old man into custody and extradited him to California under outstanding narcotics warrant. While in custody, his DNA was also matched to the 1987 murder of Carol Alford. He was indicted on 3 counts of murder with special circumstances for multiple murders in April 2013. The jury found him guilty on all counts and he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. But hold on, we didn't finish yet. Despite his conviction, Samuel Little maintained his innocence until 2018 when he agreed to be interviewed by Texas Ranger James Holland, who was assisted by FBI analysts Christy Palazzolo and Angela Williamson. Over the following year and a half, Samuel Little confessed to 93 murders during 650 hours worth of interviews. When he could remember them, he gave the names of his victims and dates of their murders. When he couldn't remember them, he drew vivid portraits to help authorities identify them. After opening up to investigators, Samuel Little pleaded guilty to the 1994 murder of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas. By cooperating with prosecutors, he avoided the death penalty and received another life sentence. He also pleaded guilty to 4 Ohio murders: Anna Stewart in 1981, Mary Jo Python in 1984, Rose Evans in 1991, and a Jane Doe whose body has yet to be discovered. As a result, he was sentenced to 4 additional consecutive life terms. The FBI has since released a timeline of Samuel Little's murders on its website, which includes all available details in the hope of identifying more of his victims. For nearly 4 decades, serial killer Samuel Little murdered and abused women, hiding in plain sight and preying on the most vulnerable members of society. A career criminal with almost 100 arrests, he was in and out of jail throughout his life for numerous offenses, but it wasn't until he reached his 70s that the extent of his crimes would be uncovered. A traveler who very rarely stayed anywhere for long, Samuel left bodies and brutalized victims as far north as Cleveland, Ohio, down to the tip of Florida and all the way out to California. He targeted drug users and sex workers, women whose claims of abuse and tragic deaths were often overlooked by law enforcement. Years after his 2014 conviction for 3 LA murders, he revealed to investigators his horrific cross-country, multi-decade murder spree. He ultimately confessed to killing 93 women between 1970 and 2005. While many of his victims remain unidentified, the FBI believes all his claims are credible, and in 2019 they declared Samuel Little the most prolific serial killer in US history. According to Samuel, he began having sensual fantasies about strangling women as a child, starting when he saw his kindergarten teacher touch her neck. As a teenager, he collected true crime magazines depicting women being choked. He got turned on by seeing these women in the magazines. In 1956, after being convicted of breaking and entering into property in Omaha, Nebraska, Samuel was held in an institution for juvenile offenders. He then moved to Florida to live with his mother in the late 1960s, working at various times as a cemetery worker and an ambulance attendant. He then began traveling more widely and had more run-ins with the law, being arrested in 8 states for crimes that included driving under the influence, fraud, shoplifting, solicitation, armed robbery, aggravated assault, and RAPE. He claimed that he took up boxing during his time in prison, referring to himself as a former prize fighter. Like I mentioned, Samuel Little went through 650 hours of police interviews, and I want to go through a couple of important details from these interviews. Of course, that 650 hours will be just, impossible to go through, so I'll just give you some recaps, maybe some pointers, especially because they contain details about some of his victims. Samuel Little called his victims grapes, objects for his consumption. He laughed out loud as he said it, as if this was a joke. Quote, "How many grapes you all got on the vine here?" End of quote. And his hands made a plucking motion, then he laughed again. He picked the grapes in the slums and rundown places, the places society ignored, the places where no one trusted police, places like Cleveland. He knew that as long as he wouldn't mess around with people who would be immediately missed and very important to either their families or their babies, children, or friends, then the police wouldn't know anything. Samuel remembered his victims' faces, but he rarely knew their names. He remembered his cars better. He drove them from city to city, paying his way with day labor and petty crime. He lured the women with promises of money or drugs. Most were hired by him. Others were seduced by him. He never used a gun or a knife. He always used his hands, and only his hands. Samuel knew which victims to stay away from. He wouldn't go in a white neighborhood to pick a housewife or, a teenage girl. He learned who to pick, and he picked those who wouldn't be missed.
More victims. One of the country's most prolific serial killers now linked to Florida. New tonight, the new mission to see if he had any more victims in our own backyard. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Wendy Ryan.
And I'm Paula Gronin for Jameson, a USF professor, now leading the charge to see if Sam Little is responsible for any number of unsolved murders here in the Bay Area.
Yeah, and new tonight, ABC Action News reporter Carson Chambers talking to one mom who just got the answer she's been waiting decades to hear. Carson?
Well, Sam Little is already linked to homicides in Tampa and Plant City and Perry and also in Homestead, Florida. But because he targeted women down on their luck, he may have more victims who just haven't been identified.
We hadn't forgot her, but we had just gave up on finding who did it.
Mom Minnie Hill lost her daughter in 1982.
When you find out the truth, that gives you some closure.
Now she knows 20-year-old Rosie Hill was murdered by a serial killer, a 78-year-old confessing in a Texas prison that he killed 90 women from 1970 to 2005.
You're sitting with evil in its purest form, but he came off like a grandfather.
Sergeant Michael Mongaluzzo with the Marion County Sheriff's Office interviewed Little face-to-face.
He told me, he said, well, God put me here to do this.
Now Tampa Bay law enforcement taking a hard look at unsolved cold cases. And this USF forensic scientist who's been working to ID women's remains from the 70s and 80s is also considering some could be Little's victims.
You see patterns, females murdered, dumped. They're probably among the hardest cases to solve because you don't know who she is.
The FBI says Little, a drifter, beat and strangled women to death from California to Florida, targeting women addicted to drugs or in prostitution. And in Hill's case, a mom who left behind a 2-year-old child.
It still doesn't help that feeling that you have, that your loved one is gone.
Okay, and the FBI says Little was a former boxer who stunned his victims by punching them in the face. His MO was to dump those bodies in rural areas.
Rose. She was Pam Smith's sister. Growing up in the 60s, Pam and Rose were close, despite the 5 years that separated them, and everyone said that they looked alike. They used to watch movies together, walk the streets of Binghamton, New York together, grew up far too fast together. They would skip school, they drank, they went on binges, they got in trouble. Pam worried that Rose was partying a bit too hard. After she turned 16, Rose disappeared. She took a trip to Cleveland with 2 friends. The friends came back, but Rose didn't. Pam was just devastated. At least every 6 months, Rose would call and Pam would ask her when is she going back home, and each time Rose would say she wasn't staying there. But for more than a decade, she stayed. As the years passed, Pam could tell, even through the phone, that Rose was doing drugs. Crack was everywhere in the late 80s, and for money, Rose said that she was a sex worker. She met a man and got married. She was Rose Evans now. In January 1990, Rose was arrested on a drug charge in Cleveland. She was booked into jail 2 more times that year. Rose visited Pam in Binghamton that year just for a short bit of time while she was on a 2-day trip. Pam remembers that Rose was traveling with a man. The man said hello, but he didn't leave the car. The man is now known to be Samuel Little. That was the last time I saw her, Pam said. The next thing that she remembers is 2 plainclothes detectives on her mother's doorstep. On 24th of August, 1991, a man walking through a field on East 39th Street found Rose around 7:40 a.m. She was face down and covered clearly in a rush by 2 large truck tires. She wore a royal blue shirt, jeans, and white canvas shoes. Detectives identified her by the contents of her pockets: her welfare card, her medical card, and 2 prescriptions. There was blood on her upper lip and nose. The coroner determined that Rose had been strangled. Drag marks were visible in the dirt leading up to where she had been placed. They started near the curb, where detectives photographed a set of large tire marks. The police conducted interview after interview. They talked to owners of businesses near the crime scene, past and current roommates, Rose's father-in-law, her husband was in jail, neighbors who knew Rose's boyfriend, her boyfriend was also in jail, and Rose's friends. They interviewed the 85-year-old man Rose had been crashing with at the Phyllis Wheatley Association home. He said he felt sorry for her and he let her stay for free. They canvassed the local motels, interviewing an employee at one on East 40th Street who reported the body. The employee identified Rose as a working girl. A man came in to say that he saw her in the field and the worker called the police. The manager of an East 55th Street motel recognized her as well, saying he had seen her the day before she died. The interviews turned up more promising leads. In January 1992, a working girl showed up at a charity hospital after being assaulted. She told police she'd been smoking crack with Rose the night she disappeared, and she saw Rose get into a 2-door burgundy car with a black man between 3 and 4 a.m. The woman also said that around that time, in September or October 1991, a man raped her and tried to strangle her with a rope. In the police report, she said that someone was raping and beating the Strawberries and is not being reported. A detective gave the woman a card and said to call if she saw the car again. Police considered several suspects, but no one was charged in Rose's death. Her case was entered into a violent criminal apprehension program database which tracks unsolved homicides. Pam can't remember ever getting an update about the case. Pam heard nothing from police for more than 2 decades. The family couldn't afford a burial, so Rose was cremated. They couldn't afford an urn either, so for 10 years, Pam kept Rose's ashes in a small box. She took it with her when she moved to a small town outside Scranton, Pennsylvania. One day she took it out to a creek. She waded out into the water and spread Rose's ashes, letting the flow take her away. Quote, "You can't live like that in a cardboard box," she says. "I just said, fly away and be happy," end of quote. When Jack Bornfeld called Pam to tell her that they found Rose's killer, she broke down on the phone. He couldn't bring her back, and no one could. She had been taken from this world by a monster. But Pam finally knew what happened to her sister, Rose. Quote, "It made me feel so wonderful that they found him," she says. Pam doesn't have to rely on her memory any longer. Jack Bornfeld sent her the mugshots of Rose, and Pam cherishes them. She keeps 2 next to her bed in her home in Pennsylvania, and another 2 are in the living room where she can look at her sister often. Quote, "I was heartbroken, but it was a relief. My sister is free now." End of quote, says Pam. Her soul is free.
New at 6 tonight, the FBI is working with local investigators to match 3 Metro Atlanta victim confessions to convicted murderer Samuel Little. Now, Little, who may be the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history, is already matched to 34 slayings nationwide.
Yeah, it's just jaw-dropping. One of those confirmed victims is from Macon, Georgia. CBS 46's Brittany Edney joins us live in studio with emotional details from that victim's family. Brittany.
Sharon and Thomas, I spoke with the victim's family about who they always blamed in this case, and what they had to say was shocking. In a small southern hometown, word quickly got around that a prolific serial killer once walked these streets.
We were raised up several blocks away from here,
including Washington Park, where we met Eddie Smith.
And,
he and his sister Fredonia played here as kids.
In this area right here.
Close in age, they were inseparable.
A lot of people thought that we was twins.
His childhood memories here were shattered in July of 1982 when she was murdered.
They found her body right there where the fence is.
But not her killer. Eddie admits he blamed Fredonia's ex-boyfriend since they had just broken up.
Actually, me and her cousin went back to kill him. I had got a gun. And, you know, it had to be the Lord working in my favor because, you know, I'm not a killer.
His plan for revenge failed because the boyfriend wasn't home.
And he disappeared.
And since then, Eddie has spent more than 30 years blaming the wrong man.
I am still hurting. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and can't go back to sleep.
Then, this past October, investigators called and said, "We know who killed your sister."
I said, "Thank you, Jesus." That's the first thing that came out of my mouth.
It was serial killer Samuel Little. He's confessed to killing more than 90 women across the country. And investigators say his story checked out.
This time, they really don't talk to me unless you don't accuse nobody, unless you really know. He approached my sister and they got into a fight. And he strangled her, you know, and then he drug her body in the bushes over there.
The skeletal remains found yesterday at the rear of 1088.
News coverage shows this family's pain at the beginning of this 36-year mystery.
Oh, it's hard. That child ain't never bothered nobody.
They didn't live to see the person responsible confess.
No.
But Eddie lived to see that the man he was ready to kill was innocent. And against all practical odds, a serial killer was behind it all.
I would like to ask him, why did you have to follow my sister? Why did you kill her? Why did you kill all these people?
Eddie Smith told me through his faith he's able to forgive Little, but he still doesn't feel like he's had that closure because he hasn't been able to confront him. Unfortunately, families won't get that chance because investigators say Little is too old and sick to stand trial here in Georgia.
In May 2019, Samuel Little was indicted on charges of aggravated murder and kidnapping for the deaths of Mary Jo Python, and Rose Evans. A few months later, he appeared in a downtown Cleveland courtroom via video link from California. He pleaded guilty to the aggravated murder charges and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Samuel Little believed that we would only remember the women like he did, faces without names and names without stories. In the interrogation room with Samuel Little, there was another conversation going on about Samuel choking his victims. He would say he would choose his victims first by the way their necks look. He did mention that unlike men who have ugly area around the neck, which is the Adam's apple, women have smooth necks, and as a child he got attracted to the neck part. 3 workers at the Madison Equipment Factory on East 82nd Street noticed the smell a little before 1 p.m. on July the 3rd, 1984. They went down into the boiler room of the factory to look for a lost cat. Stinking liquid seeped in through a crack under an exterior door which opened into an outside stairwell. For months, workers in the factory passed near the door as they went to and from their cars in the nearby parking lot, but no one noticed anything strange. They went outside and looked into the 6-foot deep stairwell overgrown by ivy and weeds. She laid there at the bottom of the stairs, her face toward the sky, legs and arms spread at odd angles. Her body was decomposing, crawling with maggots. She wore a sandal on her right foot. Her sweater and bra had been pulled around her shoulders. She wore a ring on her right pinky and was nude from the waist down. Detectives swarmed the scene, taking photographs. Her body was taken to the coroner's office. Samuel Gerber, the coroner, believed that she was a slender white woman between 26 and 28 years old. She likely died in May or June. The cause of death was undetermined. In the name field and on her fingerprint card, she was listed as unknown white female, unidentified, found in outside basement stairwell. Police believed she may have jumped from the roof until they learned the factory's alarm system hadn't tripped. They ran her fingerprints and tried to match her with missing persons reports, but they didn't turn up a name. Years went by and the investigation continued. In October, police released a reconstruction of her face to the plain dealer and looked into tips. In 1987 and 1990, detectives tried to match her against missing persons reports from Florida and Indiana and checked against dental records and in the National Crime Information Center, but they found nothing. In 1992, a detective noticed that due to some oversight, the victim's fingerprints had been entered into Cleveland Police's fingerprint database, but not the national one. The fingerprint card with clear impressions of the woman's right thumb was sent to the FBI. The next month, a letter arrived from Quantico, Virginia. They found a match. Information about the woman was lacking. She had been arrested a few times in Cleveland, once in 1981 for prostitution. She was 18 at the time. Her jail booking card described her as possible suicidal. She was arrested again for soliciting in 1982 in the area of East 100th Street and Cedar Avenue. She appeared to be from Kentucky. Cleveland police filed a case in 1984 under the cause of death from the coroner undetermined. But now police had a name to put on their reports. Her name was Mary Jo Python. On November 11, 2018, in the interrogation room of Wise County Detention Center, Decatur, Texas, Samuel sat waiting for 2 men from Cleveland. Samuel had been extradited to Texas from California in September 2018, where he continued talking with James Holland. He even began to draw remarkably specific pictures of his victims' faces. These interviews were all recorded, and Christy Palazzolo and Angela Williamson sent word to law enforcement across the country. A select group were invited to interview Samuel Little. On October the 1st, an email from Angela Williamson got into Richard Bell's inbox. The email to Richard, Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Chief of Special Investigations, said that Samuel Little confessed to 3 possible murders in Cleveland. One popped up in the VICAP system. Richard Bell and Jack Bornfeld, the prosecutor's investigator and former Cleveland police homicide detective, got on a plane and they came prepared. Richard had even chosen his clothing specifically to put Samuel at ease because Samuel hated prosecutors. One in Los Angeles, Beth Silverman, put Samuel's victims on the witness stand and sent him to jail for life. Even mentioning the California case would throw Samuel into a foul mood. So instead of a suit, Richard opted for jeans. He had also studied cars, a favorite topic of Samuel's, and was prepared to talk about the Cleveland Browns, which was another favorite of Samuel's. Richard Bell didn't really like catering to Samuel, but he really wanted to get a confession out of him. Richard Bell and Jack Bornfeld had gone to Texas with the hopes of charging Samuel Little. Samuel, however, would only talk if spared the death penalty. So Richard had a letter to that effect, which prosecutor Mike O'Malley reviewed. In the interrogation room, James Holland handed the letter to Samuel Little. He examined the letter, folded the letter up, put it in his shirt pocket, and then asked, "How can I help you?" After some talk about the Cleveland Browns, about 20 minutes into the interview, they soon turned to the murders. Jack handed the photograph across the table to Samuel, asking if the woman in the photo looked familiar. "Yes, this is her," said Samuel. He was staring at the photo of Mary Jo Python, holding it with 2 hands. "That's her," asked Bornfield, and Samuel confirmed. He met her around East 105 Street and Euclid Avenue. The area, the entrance to University Circle, had a reputation for being friendly to the SCX trade at the time. Entrepreneur and self-styled black revolutionary landlord Winston Willis assembled a complex of bar, porn theaters and nightclubs, as well as businesses of the same reputable sort there in that area in the 1970s. By 1984, the Cleveland Clinic was fast making its mark, but some of the old districts still remained. Samuel said that he met Mary Jo at a bar in the area. She was sitting on a stool. Samuel pawed at his face as he told the story, the long fingernails scratching audibly against his beard. "She saw me and then we made a date," Little said. Mary Jo got in his car, a black 1976 Thunderbird. She directed him to a warehouse on East 82nd Street. When they got there, they did their thing and then Samuel choked her. At this point, Richard Bell and Jack Bornfeld had their first confession, but they weren't done because a few minutes later, Jack opened his portfolio, which had 3 of Rose's mugshots. Samuel became very curious, peeking to see who's there. Samuel Little picked up the photo of Rose in the cartoon character shirt. He picked Rose up near East 55th Street and Central Avenue in 1991. She had been smoking crack with a group of men and got into his bubble-top van. They drove to an old man's house where she stayed for about 20 minutes to get money for more drugs, then got back into the van with Samuel. But when they pulled onto East 39th Street, Rose refused to get into the back of the van. "You're going to kill me back there," Samuel remembers Rose saying. Rose fought him all the way, regaining consciousness several times. But Samuel was bigger, heavier, stronger. He dragged her body into a field and covered it with 2 large tires. Samuel also confessed to another killing in Cleveland. Angela, the Department of Justice liaison, told Richard Bell, and then him and Jack Bornfeld questioned Samuel about this, but they didn't find a body to match the confession. Angela then connected Richard with Jamie Onion, a Willoughby Hills detective. For years, the case of the woman by the highway sat in a cardboard box, one of only 2 unsolved homicides in the Willoughby Hills Police Department. A resident of White Road found her on March 18, 1983, while he was walking his dog in the forest near Interstate 271. She had been there for a long time. The remains were mostly skeletal, laying on the ground a few dozen feet from the highway. Several bones were missing, apparently taken by wildlife. Because of the overgrown forest, the wire fence, this was hidden from view. Willoughby Hills detectives found the remains with a blue-green dress, size 8 to 10, a coat-length knit sweater, a man's Elgin watch, a gold and silver ring, size 7.5, black high heels and a gold chain on which hung a 2-inch crucifix with a raised figure of Christ. Police told the newspapers that the cause of death hadn't been determined, but they suspected foul play. They thought she was most likely a black woman, probably between 20 and 35 years old. Due to the age of the remains, police struggled to identify her. She had been there by the highway in Willoughby Hills for months, maybe even years. A specialist made a reconstruction of her face from the skeleton. She had a wide nose and high cheekbones. Police hoped someone she knew would recognize her, but for decades no one did. In October 2018, Detective Onion and his partner, Detective Ron Parmenter, pulled the case out for a second look. They knew from reading about Samuel Little that he had operated in the Cleveland area and wondered if he might be connected to their case, so they contacted the FBI to find out. Detective Onion didn't know it, but Samuel had already confessed to a similar murder. Samuel told Bell and Bornfeld he picked up a black woman near East 39th Street and Broadway Avenue in the late 1970s and strangled her. A police car drove by, so he got on the highway he believed towards Akron. He dumped her in a wooded area near a fence. Bornfeld went through missing persons reports and homicide files trying to find a body that matched his description. He and Bell also drove up and down Interstate 77 and reviewed aerial photos of the highway, but they came up empty. The Willoughby Hills case looked like the match they'd been looking for. Detective Onion and Parmenter's confidence grew when they flew down to Texas to interview Samuel Little in December 2018. But some of the details Samuel offered were different. Samuel thought he was heading on the highway toward Akron. He seemed uncertain of the woman's clothing, giving conflicting descriptions, and said that he dumped the body over a fence when it was found in front of a fence. They believed Samuel Little most likely killed the Jane Doe, but given his conflicting descriptions, they wanted to identify the victim before charging him. Bell and Onion requested a DNA sample of her remains from the medical examiner's office and sent it off to a lab for genealogical testing. In January 2019, the Akron Police Department was sent a confession and drawing of Samuel's. Detective Clay Cozart matched it with the missing persons case of Roberta Tenderick, who was found dead in Firestone Metro Park on September 30th, 1991. The Summit County coroner ruled her cause of death as unknown. The details of the case matched Samuel Little's confession. Cozart also showed the picture Samuel had drawn to Roberta's daughter, who confirmed it looked like her mother. As of early January 2020, the test results in the Willoughby Hills case have yet to be returned. The Jane Doe is still unidentified.
It now describes Samuel Little as the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history after he confessed to murdering 93 people. Little was sentenced to 3 life terms in 2014 for killing 3 women. Now investigators are asking the public to help identify his other victims. 60 Minutes spoke to Little and the Texas Ranger who got him to tell his stories using a sketch pad. Our national correspondent Jerika Duncan is following this amazing story. Jerika, how many cases has this solved?
Well, that Texas Ranger told 60 Minutes that 50 cold cases have been solved with Little's cooperation. Now, Little has described in detail how he killed his victims, and he even remembers what some of them look like.
Wow.
These are all of his drawings.
These are all his.
These are the faces of some of the women serial killer Samuel Little says he's killed.
1972.
Right, yes.
When you come up in there, you...
Over the course of 700 hours of interviews while in prison for murdering 3 women, Little confessed to Texas Ranger James Holland that he'd killed many more.
What city did you kill the most in?
Miami and Los Angeles.
And how many did you kill in Los Angeles?
Los Angeles, approximately 20.
The 79-year-old is believed to have murdered 93 people in 19 states from 1970 to 2005. That's more than triple the number of people Ted Bundy confessed to killing. In an interview with 60 Minutes correspondent Sharon Alfonsi, Holland shared his impression of the serial killer.
The first thing I picked up on is how wicked smart he was. This guy
Smart.
is, like genius.
Why?
Yes,
Why do you say
absolutely.
that?
Oh, well, number one, the photographic memory, his memory for details.
Holland put that memory to use and gave Little, who likes to sketch, art supplies. Little drew around 50 of his victims. In a recent phone interview with 60 Minutes, he reflected on his crimes.
I don't think there was another person that did what I'd like to do. I'm thinking the only one in the world. And that's not an honor. That is a curse.
They're very grandiose.
Retired FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole says serial killers like Little often enjoy the attention that comes with confessing.
They're not sorry for what they've done. They're very proud of being able to, number one, get away with it, and number two, to talk about how very good they were at being a serial killer.
Yeah, I got my mom here.
Little's confessions have led to answers for many people, like Damian Christie, who was 14 when his mother was killed.
They say that, do you have closure? And I kind of look at it as like, well, I have answers.
But for Holland, it won't be over until all of Little's victims are identified.
It's kind of like never ending. You have to continue. You have to finish it.
Just last week, Holland received 3 new sketches. He continues to encourage Little to draw. Because Little is in poor health, Holland says the race is on to identify all of the serial killer's alleged victims while he's still alive and willing to cooperate.
Now, Holland, that Texas Ranger's done amazing work with him to help pull this out and help solve cases for families, who've had unanswered questions for so long.
It was upsetting to watch it, though, guys, because he was so cavalier and seemingly had no remorse. A couple of times he was even laughing about it. Yep. And I think what all victims' family want to know is that you feel some remorse.
In May 2018, FBI VICAP analyst Christy Palazzolo and Department of Justice liaison Angela Williamson sat listening to an audio feed in the guard room of California State Prison, Los Angeles County in Lancaster, hoping that their suspect would open up. In another room, Samuel Little, a grandfatherly-looking 77-year-old with droopy eyelids and a wheelchair, sat across from Texas Ranger James Holland, a veteran interrogator with a reputation for unlocking suspects. Samuel Little was an enigma. In 2014, he had been convicted of strangling 3 women in Los Angeles in 1987 and 1989. DNA evidence found on 2 of the victims' shirts and under the 3rd woman's fingernails linked him to those murders. Investigators knew that he traveled throughout the country. They suspected he left a trail of even more crimes behind him, but he refused to talk to law enforcement. At the 2014 trial, prosecutors presented a case that went far beyond the 3 killings. They prosecuted Samuel Little as a serial killer who attempted to kill many times before. Over 2 weeks, several women who said they had near-death run-ins with him in the 1980s took the stand. One woman said that Samuel had tied her up in 1984 in San Diego, then choked her and pushed her out of his car into a pile of trash. A month after that incident, police found a bleeding, unconscious woman in Samuel Little's car. Another woman from Pascagoula, Mississippi, said he had beaten her in 1981 so badly that blood trickled from her eyes like tears. She didn't report the encounter to police. Quote, "They don't care nothing about no black prostitute in Pascagoula," end of quote, she said, according to the Los Angeles Times. In 2013, analyst Christy Palazzolo received a call from the detectives on the Los Angeles case. She helped them by putting together a detailed timeline of Samuel's whereabouts and also researched other killings in which Samuel could be a suspect, such as the 1994 murder of Denise Christie brothers in Odessa, Texas. Samuel's rap sheet, the Associated Press reported at the time, had entries spanning 24 states over 56 years. Samuel Little was no doubt dangerous and he wasn't talking, but James Holland, Christy Palazzolo and Angela Williamson went to California in 2018 after other investigators suggested that Samuel may be linked to more cases. At first, the interrogation went nowhere. James Holland gave Samuel peanut M&Ms and they started talking casually about boxing. He played to Samuel's vanity, telling him that the feds were interested in him. Samuel was extremely cautious, especially because he had beaten charges before. But then James Holland mentioned the Odessa case. It was either his Texas accent that got Samuel talking, or maybe it was the fact that James would avoid any references to the words rape and murder, instead calling Samuel's crimes killings, playing along when Samuel would scrape his fingernails across his beard, as he often did when he was remembering things and talked about my girls. Or maybe it was the promise that prosecutors wouldn't pursue the death penalty. Whatever it was, Samuel's stories began being poured out. Samuel talked about the Odessa killing, and then others, and still others more. Over 2 days, Samuel Little confessed to 20 murders. He was often fuzzy with the dates, but his recollection of the Odessa case matched crime scene photographs and the police reports. He also told James Holland he thought he killed around 100 women. Now, Christy, the analyst, and Angela were quite skeptical at first, but as cases matched back to Samuel's confessions, the precise details and level of accuracy helped confirm his stories. I've got some information from the FBI website with Samuel Little's confessions, and I want to go through them a bit as he speaks about the victims. Samuel's recollection of dates is not always accurate, and he doesn't always remember the clothing worn by the victim. The videos that I am going to show you from his unmatched confessions have drawings of the victims made by Samuel.
Tell me about Mary Ann.
She's what you nowadays they call a transgender.
She's a black male dressed up as a female. Okay. How tall is she?
Mary Ann's about 5'7", 5'6". She weighed about 135.
Okay.
Maybe 140.
And how old do you think she was?
She was 19.
Okay. And where was she from?
No, Miami, down in Liberty City.
Okay. And did she, you'd mentioned before she had a boyfriend, or she talked about a boyfriend?
Named Wes.
Wes?
Yeah.
And tell me about where you met her at.
I seen her down at the Guar on 17th Avenue, and she had on a short cream miniskirt.
Mm-hmm.
Cream and red. So then this opportunity popped up.
Mm-hmm.
Take her to the store.
Right.
Instead of me bringing her back to the apartment, I went down 27th Street. That's going down to Fort Lauderdale, called the Alligator Alley. It runs into the Alligator Alley.
Right.
But the further out you get, the further you get out of Miami.
Right.
And you got vegetation.
Now, how far outside of Miami do you think you were?
It wasn't too far to Miami, right there. I was in my stepdad's car, Pontiac, Le Mans.
Now, where'd you take her to?
Continued down 27. Got back on 27.
Going outside of Miami. Okay.
Miami.
Going away from Miami.
Going away from Miami. We got down past the let's say limits, so I continued on toward Fort Lauderdale, and I seen a road going off the main road back into vegetation on the left side. So I got her out of the car, pulled her out, and drug her into growths back there, and pulled deeper into there's a path. A little path was running somewhere. I don't know where it led it to, but it was running deeper into the undergrowth. It's like Everglades like that. And we ran into some water running. But before we got to the water, the earth was mushy. I turned her loose, and she fell into it face down.
And how far outside of Miami do you think you were?
About a mile, 2 miles.
What year did Marianne occur?
72.
Okay, 1972. North Little Rock. Tell me what that girl looked like.
Oh man, I loved her. I forget her name. Oh wait, I think it was Ruth.
Okay.
She was a heavy set, big old yellow gal, and had buck teeth. It had a gap between the teeth, that's what it was. And she was like honey colored skin, and she had like her hair was not really long. It was.
How tall do you think she was?
She was about 5'7".
How much do you think she weighed?
She weighed about close to 200, about 170.
Pretty big girl.
Yeah.
Now, where did you meet her at?
Okay, down in the crack house. Her and about 6 other girls were sitting on the porch. The dude selling crack in there. I stopped to go in there. I seen the girls, that's why I stopped. We stayed together 2 days or more. I think about 3 days. We was going shoplifting. We went to Sears. We went to Kroger's, and that's where I got busted. They took me to jail, and she went and stayed in the car. And the manager of Kroger's, I guess he got tired of her laying up on his property in that car. He called the station where I was at in North Arkansas to drop the charges. So he can come down and get this gal and car out of here. They cut me loose. So we was headed toward with that place where Walmart's original store bent. I whooped off the road and back into that little woods. It was a cornfield back there. I pulled through it, and on the other side of the cornfield was a trash pile. I parked the car facing out where I could see anybody coming in. So I pulled her out of the car. She's too big for me to carry her. So I just pulled her out of the car and laid on that trash that was lit there.
So was it like a cornstalk pile, or was it?
Yeah, a bunch of corn stalks.
What could you see from there?
I could see the highway, and in the woods is that way. But it's right outside of Little Rock. I was about 10 miles from it.
From North Little Rock, you think 10 miles?
Yeah, it was about 10 miles.
Okay. Hey, tell me about Northern Kentucky, the girl that you met in Columbus. So you meet this girl, I guess you're at a strip bar downtown Columbus.
I went on my car, and this white girl come out behind the building. And I'm in my trunk. She walked over to me, say, come on, y'all, can you take me to Miami?
Describe this girl to me. Is she white, black? What she look like?
She was white, blonde hair, dishwater blonde, they go. It's short.
Short, like shoulder length?
Yeah,
or
no, ear length, a little over his ear length.
Like a bob?
Yeah, like a bob.
Okay, and how tall do you think she was?
She was about 5'7".
How much do you think she weighed?
She weighed about 130.
How old do you think she was?
Oh, she was about 25.
Okay. You mentioned before that you said she kind of had like this hippie aura to her.
Yeah, she did give you a hippie feeling. I think she was some kind of hippie, yeah.
So you go to Cincinnati, you mess around on Vine Street, and then eventually you guys both get in your car and you cross over the bridge into Kentucky. Tell me about going into Kentucky.
We got to Covington, and then we continued through Covington. And there was a park that they were having a festival there. And she heard the music and shit off of that band in there. And by her being a hippie type, she wanted to get to that. But the police came over and peeped in our car. He really wanted me to move out of there. So instead of going in there, I took her the other way.
Right.
Winding around, they got hills down in Kentucky, and the road winds around the hills. I seen a little short road going up the hill, and up top there was vegetation, wasn't no houses or nothing. And so I pulled up and concealed the car in that little vegetation up there on top of the hill.
So tell me about this road that goes up the hill. What kind of road is it?
It was like a dirt road.
Okay.
It was like dirt. The grass was growing in the middle between two tracks. When I left her up in that little road up there, on the side of that little road, she was like partially concealed by the vegetation. I left her there.
Las Vegas. Describe the Las Vegas victim.
That was in '93.
Okay.
I bought a Eldorado.
What color Eldorado?
It was a yellow.
Okay. Yellow Cadillac Eldorado.
Yep.
All right. What year?
78.
Okay. Well, tell me about this girl. What does she look like?
She was kind of thin, dark skinned, about 40 years old when she was out there hustling. I think she was a drug addict because she wouldn't have been out there.
How tall was she?
She was about 5'5", 5'3".
And how much do you think she weighed?
She weighed about 110, 120.
Okay. What about her did you know?
The boy came, that was her son. And she called him over there. And he came over, he shook my hand and everything. Yeah.
Now how old was he?
He was about 20 or about 19, 20.
Okay, black male or?
Black male.
And where were you at when you met her?
It was on Owens Avenue.
Okay.
Owens, that's down in the black section. Owens and Jackson.
Where do you eventually take her body to?
I was headed toward California. So as I drove out of Las Vegas, I seen a motel and a road leading up to the motel. And there's a lot of bushes and brushes beside the road before you got to that motel. That's where I pulled up her body out and rolled it down there. And I heard a secondary roll of noise. That meant she was still rolling.
So you basically roll her into a pretty big ditch that's got a bunch of...
Well, it wasn't a ditch, it was a slope.
Okay.
That didn't look like a slope because the vegetation had grown up out of the slope and looked like you would think that the road would just be flat. But actually the road was going down, a slope like. And that's why she rolled.
So this is a slope right off the road?
Yeah.
Okay. And tell me about how far do you think you were outside of Las Vegas?
The road I was on was going towards Searchlight. So whatever the name of that road is, that's the road I was on.
How far outside of Las Vegas do you think you were? Were you in Las Vegas?
I was still in Las Vegas, yeah.
Okay.
But I was on the very outskirts.
All right.
The very outskirts. There was a couple of motels I remember, gas stations, and it was scattered, because it was getting thin population as you go further out. She was pretty, a light-skinned, brown, honey-colored skin. And she was she was tall for a woman, about 5'8", 5'9", and beautiful shape. And she's friendly. And how much do you think she weighed? She had a beautiful body, a beautiful 150, well put together. And how old do you think she was? She was about 30. Okay, and she's a black female. Yeah. And tell me where you met her. I met her in a nightclub in New Orleans. Her and her sister she had two sisters. Her and her youngest sister was having a birthday party. Her sister was dancing with this guy on the floor. And when I come in, the girl that I was with offered me to dance with me. And while we were dancing, she says, you want to go riding after this, after this party's over? We walked outside and she looked and seen my car at Lincoln. She said, ooh, that's a beautiful car too. So she had arm in arm, walking to the car. We got in, stopped at the gas station. We were on the Highway 10 and going toward Slidell. I seen the sign say Little Woods. Mm-hmm. So I cut off, I took off the exit, went, and that sure enough was the road leading into the woods. And we went in and parked. So we finally got to where we were going. And it was by a bayou, a river, a little water thing. And the big, they had a machine out there in that little river.
Dredging? Okay.
I grabbed her by the legs and pulled her to the water. Mm-hmm. That's the only one that I ever killed by drowning.
Describe the location where she's left.
Okay, I left her with her head still there in the water, half her body in the underwater, and her thighs and legs on the bank.
Samuel recounted that in 1971 or 1972 he met an attractive 18 to 19-year-old transgender black woman in Miami, Florida. Her name was Marianne or Mary Ann. Marianne was between 5 feet 6 inches, 5 feet 7 inches tall and approximately 140 pounds. He first met her at a bar known as the Pool or Pool Palace near 17th Avenue in Miami. A few days later, they met again at a bar in Overtown where he offered to give her a ride home. Marianne lived with several other roommates between Brownsville and Liberty City. When they arrived there, one of Marianne's roommates asked them to buy a can of shaving cream. So they returned to Samuel's car, a gold 4-door Pontiac Le Mans. He drove Marianne north on Highway 27 and killed her on a driveway, possibly near a sugarcane field. He then drove further down Highway 27 into the Everglades and turned down a dirt road that led to a river or a swamp. He dragged her body approximately 200 yards into the thick, muddy water. He doesn't believe her body was ever found. North Little Rock, Arkansas, 1992-1994. Samuel said he met a black female in a transient area of Little Rock, Arkansas, between 1992 and 1994. It was cold and possibly snowing when they met. He described her as 24 years old, 5 foot 5 inches, 5 foot 7 inches tall, and approximately 200 pounds. He stayed with her on and off for about 3 days. He allegedly shoplifted with the woman, then she sold the merchandise. Samuel was arrested for shoplifting in a North Little Rock Kroger grocery store. Records indicate that he was in fact arrested by North Little Rock Police Department for shoplifting from a Kroger on April 20th, 1994. According to Samuel, he was released after approximately 3 hours so that he could move his vehicle, a 1978 yellow Cadillac Eldorado or possibly a yellow Dodge, off the grocery store's property. When he returned to his vehicle, the woman was sleeping inside. He first drove her to meet her ex-boyfriend, a man called Bear, then drove her back to her house. He returned the following day and drove with her toward Benton or Bentonville, Arkansas. When they were outside Little Rock, Samuel drove down a dirt road and manually strangled the woman to death. He placed her body on a pile of branches and old corn stalks in or near a cornfield. He believes the woman's name may have been Ruth and that her mother lived in North Little Rock. Covington, Kentucky, 1984. Samuel stated that in approximately 1984, maybe in the summertime, he was driving his Lincoln Continental Mark III from Lorain, Ohio to Cincinnati. While en route, he met a 25-year-old white female outside the strip club. He remembers her as being 5 foot 6 inches, 5 foot 7 inches tall and 130-170 pounds. She had short blonde hair and blue eyes with a hippie appearance. She approached him and asked for a ride to Miami, saying her mother lived there. They drove south on Interstate 75. When they reached Cincinnati, the two of them spent time downtown on Vine Street. they continued driving together across the river into northern Kentucky. Samuel described driving to a hilly area not far from Interstate 75. He drove up a small dirt road to the top of a little round hill where he strangled the woman in the back seat of his car. He left her body on the top of the hill. Las Vegas, Nevada, 1993. In 1993, Samuel was driving a 1978 yellow Cadillac Eldorado to Los Angeles when he met a black woman on Owens Avenue or Jackson Street in Las Vegas. He described her as a thin, dark-skinned woman who was approximately 40 years old. She was about 5 foot 5 inches tall and 110-120 pounds. He believed the woman had naturally short hair but wore a long-haired wig, as depicted in his drawing. He remembered the woman pointing out her son, a black male who was approximately 19-23 years old. Samuel took her to a motel room where he strangled her to death. He then placed the woman's body in the trunk of his car and drove to the outskirts of Las Vegas. He pulled off on a remote road and rolled the woman's body down a steep slope. He then threw her clothes out further down the road. It's highly likely that her body was never found. Nothing happened to her son, but in Samuel's words, his aim was to get the woman away from her son to kill her. When he saw her son, that's when he started thinking only about getting her away from her son. New Orleans, Louisiana, 1982. In approximately 1982, possibly in the autumn, Samuel met a black female in New Orleans. He described her as approximately 30-40 years old, 5 foot 8 inches, 5 foot 9 inches tall, weighing 160 pounds, with honey-colored brown skin and medium-length straight hair. She was wearing a dress with buttons on the front. They met in a club where she was attending a birthday party with a group of friends and one of her 2 sisters. He left with her in his vehicle, a Lincoln Continental Mark III. She told Samuel that she lived with her mother, who was sickly and possibly disabled. She also gave him the keys to her house. He drove her to the Little Woods exit off Interstate 10, where he turned down a dirt road along a canal that was being dredged. They got out of his car. He then pulled her towards the canal, where he killed her and left her body. He then drove back to the motel where he was staying in Pascagoula, Mississippi. 5 years after analysts with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, also known as VICAP, began linking cases to convicted murderer Samuel Little, and nearly 18 months after the Texas Ranger began to elicit from him a breathtaking number of confessions, the FBI, like I mentioned previously, has confirmed Little to be the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history. Samuel Little has confessed, as we now know, to 93 murders, and FBI crime analysts believe all of his confessions are credible. Law enforcement has been able to verify 50 confessions, with many more pending final confirmation. Samuel said he strangled his 93 victims between 1970 and 2005. Many of his victims' deaths, however, were originally ruled overdoses or attributed to accidental or undetermined causes. Some bodies were never found. For many years, Samuel Little believed he would not be caught because he thought no one was accounting for his victims, said VICAP crime analyst Christy Palazzolo. Even though he is already in prison, the FBI believes it's important to seek justice for each victim, to close every case possible. The FBI is asking for the public's help in matching the remaining unconfirmed confessions. VICAP, with the support of the Texas Rangers, has provided additional information and details about 5 cases in hopes that someone may remember a detail that could further the investigation. If you would like to see all the information about the unidentified victims, you can check the FBI website. I will leave it in the description down below. It's very, very important. Maybe you have a family member who went missing, never heard from them again. Maybe Samuel's drawings will help you identify another victim and the family can finally get some kind of closure. please do check out the website. If you have any information as tiny as you think it might be or insignificant, please contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. Samuel Little was 80 years old when he passed away at a California hospital in December 2020. Although the cause of death was never revealed, he had diabetes, heart issues, and other unspecified ailments. According to a California Corrections Department, there was no evidence of foul play. It's unclear if he died alone or he was with a family member or partner at the time of death. And this is, guys, the twisted story of Samuel Little. The most heartbreaking thing is that most of his victims have never been found and they can't get to have a proper burial. Maybe family or friends who need closure, or just the victims to have a resting place. I watched very recently the documentary on telly, which I have no idea whatsoever how is it called or on which channel I watched it on, because honestly I never pay attention to these things, and I also have a very bad memory when it comes to remembering names, documentary names, titles, movie titles, actors, actresses, singers, and so on and so forth. However, I got completely hooked on this documentary when I watched it, and that's the reason why I actually decided to cover Samuel Little, because not only is it heartbreaking what he did, but on the other hand, from another point of view, such as me covering, true crime cases in general, I find it quite fascinating. I have seen him and I have watched all of his interviews. I've seen this documentary, and what I can say is that I'm gonna say I watched all of his interviews which were released by the FBI, because I didn't watch 650 hours, that's for sure. It's impossible. And what I can say is that when he's describing the victims and what he did with them and how he did it, he's enjoying it. He received a platform where he could replay all of his murders, all of these things that made him the serial killer that he was. Is he, or better yet, was he a sociopath? I don't know about that. He could have been, because his murders were not planned. He drove around in different towns and different cities, and he just on a whim decided that that woman is going to be his next victim. He chose his victims specifically. Black women in bad areas, mostly prostitutes and drug addicts, or both. And I'll reference here how he called his own mother Lady of the Night. So he basically chose ladies of the night as his victims, because he knew that these women, nobody will notice that they are missing. Nobody will look for them, and nobody will pay attention to them, because not only were they black women, but they were also prostitutes and drug addicts. And unfortunately, this is very true. It's still the case, and certainly was the case back then at the time. Prostitutes and black women in general will not really be noticed by police in terms of them being victims, so of course that he knew he's not going to get caught. What fascinates me the most is that even more than 40 years later, after the Texas Ranger got him to confess to all of these murders, he still has the murders in his head. Because if you look at the pictures that he was drawing of his victims, not only did he have a photographic memory, but he remembers details. He remembers their hair color, he remembers their eyes, their facial expressions. He remembers what they were wearing, how tall they were, their weight. He remembers details that after 40 years, any other person would struggle to remember. So this to me suggests that not only he had a photographic memory, but he's replaying all of these murders in his head constantly. And that's how his memory is so fresh of all these tiny little details. If you look at his drawings, you can clearly see that every single woman has different features around her neck. Every single woman is important to him in terms of her neck. Every single woman's neck is important, because in every single one of his drawings, not one neck is the same as the other, which means that he paid attention. He paid a lot of attention to their necks. He remembers their necks. He's really reliving the crimes in his head. And the most important thing to him was the neck. He had a neck fetish. And I think that he is one of the very few who actually had this kind of neck fetishes. Because in his own words, when he was in a relationship, when he was married, and when he had romantic relationships, he tried not to look at his partner's necks for the same reason, so he doesn't kill them. Because I think that looking at the neck would trigger his, should I say, animal instinct of attacking, perhaps. You know, when I was talking about this with my husband, about Samuel Little, because me and my husband, both of us were watching this documentary, and both of us were completely fascinated and completely hooked on it, I couldn't help but think, and I said it to my husband as well, this basic instinct, the basic animal instinct, you know, like for example, when you have a cat, the cat is attracted to your neck, right? The cat is attracted to the pulse in your neck, watching the movement, how your neck moves when you have the pulse going. And that's the basic animal instinct, I think. I can't help but compare this basic animal instinct with Samuel's crimes, because I think that Samuel, he touched his basic animal instinct, because in the end, we are still animals. All of us, we are still animals, and we still have that basic instinct. And for him, not only that he touched his basic animal instinct, but also he found sensual gratification from choking. Watching the interviews with Samuel Little in his confessions, he was not only aroused by remembering his victims and what he did to them, but, which is very disgusting to me to say, he was physically in the interview room using his hand to his genitalia, if you know what I mean, suggesting that even at the time when he's remembering all of these things, he still has these movies playing in his head, and he's still getting aroused and excited by what he did. And for him, I don't think it was as much the process of the neck choking, but the process before. It was the excitement, it was the high, and the feeling that he got from this, from slowly touching the victim, caressing their legs or caressing their hand, slowly moving his hand upwards towards their breasts, gaining their trust so that they are comfortable with him, so that they don't fight back. And then he will slowly go and touch their neck, and when he put his hand on their neck, that's when the instinct hit, and that's when he started choking them. The moment when he started choking them, it was very personal. And for him, it did make sense to be very personal, because he wanted to feel everything. He would choke the victim just enough to get them to be unconscious, and then he would let them come back around, and then he will do it again and again until they died. It was personal. He looked them in the eyes whilst he was choking them. He looked them in the eyes because he wanted to see the exact horror in their eyes as he was choking them, as they knew they are going to die. He wanted to see their life vanishing in front of him, in my opinion. And again, in my opinion, this was for him more than exciting. This was for him more than gratifying. And I think that all of this stemmed from his childhood, from his mother abandoning him when he was a baby, from his mother being a prostitute, from his mother leaving him on the side of the road when he was a baby. And now you need to remember, because it will make sense, it kind of triggers his murder spree. Think about it. According to him, he said that he started first to think about the neck and to have this fetish about the neck when he was about 5 years old, when his kindergarten teacher touched her neck, right? But obviously he didn't know much of it at the time, and then when he was around 7 years old, he started thinking about choking people. But he didn't go through with it, right? Then, when he was a teenager, he started looking at all these true crime magazines which were published, and women being shown in different positions being choked. And when he saw these women being choked and how they looked and the expression on their faces, this is when he knew that this is what he wants to do, and this is when he knew that this is what he wants to experience. For him, it was exciting seeing all the women in the true crime magazines, and also from these true crime magazines he learned how not to be detected. He knew what police was looking for at the crime scenes, he knew not to leave traces, he knew where to dispose of the bodies, and he knew which victims to target. So he spent his teenage years in all of these detention centers, and if you don't really have a life, you don't really have a proper education, and then on top of everything, he also learned how to go undetected, and by the time he started killing people, by the time he started killing women, he already had all of this knowledge in mind, and now the only thing that was left for him was to act on his fantasies. And when did he start acting on his fantasies? If you remember, he reconnected with his mother who left him when he was a baby. He reconnected with her in the late 60s, and it was around when he was about 29 years old, and in his late 20s, in his early 30s. That's when he started to actually kill someone, very shortly after he reconnected with his mother and started living with her. It's my opinion, I really think that if he wouldn't reconnect with his mother, he would probably not go on these killing sprees. I think that seeing his mother triggered all of his childhood trauma and brought all of this back, and that's when he started to lash out, and that's when he started to kill, because he didn't know how to deal with all of his childhood trauma stemming from the moment that his mother left him. And now she's back in his life and something just clicks in his mind, right? Remember that his mom was a prostitute, was a lady of the night. His victims were prostitutes. His mom was black. His victims, most of them were black, drug addicts, prostitutes, or both, ladies of the night. And I truly think that he started killing all of these women because of his abandonment issues. Once he choked his victims and killed them, they were not useful to him anymore. They were just objects being tossed. The grapes, as he said, they were his possessions until he acted out on them, and then they were nothing to him. However, what's interesting is that he did want these women to have an identity, and he wanted them to be found, but of course that he didn't want him to be linked to them. He was actually very upset when the police couldn't give these women a name after he had the FBI to identify them. He was distraught that some of them were being called Jane Does. He wanted them identified. He wanted their names known. And again, I think that he wanted this because it made him feel like these were real. You know what I mean? If this woman has a name, it's very important. It makes her more real to him. It gives him even more pleasure because he can now match the name with the murder, and the movie is constantly playing in his head. You remember, guys, when I mentioned the Texas Ranger who managed to get Samuel to open up to the crimes that he committed? Yes, the Texas Ranger gave Samuel the space that he needed to speak about his crimes. And can you just imagine someone 40 years later to have all of these vivid memories, down to the clothing the women were wearing, down to the color of the hair, down to the hairstyle, down to the facial expressions. Can you just imagine 40 years later, in all this time, you are sitting there reliving all of the crimes over and over and over again in your head, that you actually get it so imprinted in your brain that you then manage to grab a pencil and just start drawing? Can you just imagine that? Because most of us, me for example, if you ask me what did I eat 3 days ago, I wouldn't be able to tell you what I had 3 days ago, because who sits around and tries so hard to get all of these memories, right? For him, for Samuel Little to do that suggests that he was constantly playing and replaying all these crimes over and over and over in his brain. He was remembering because he was satisfied by them. He was still playing the fantasies from the crimes that he committed. For him, this was the most important thing. With his victims, he didn't care about their bodies, how they looked from the neck down. It was all about the neck, all about his control and his power. I can just imagine him going on the street, having a conversation, and instead of making eye contact with someone, right, he would just stare at the neck, just looking at the neck. And I'll be honest with you guys, honestly, seriously, from now on, I'll never be able to look at someone's neck without remembering Samuel Little and what he did. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Please let me know what do you guys think in the comment section down below. Also, again, please don't forget to make sure you check out the FBI website. The link for it will be in the description down below. Maybe you see a drawing and maybe it's someone that you recognize, and maybe the victim's family can get some closure. Maybe, you know, the victim can have a proper burial and rest in peace properly. Again, thank you so much for watching. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.